Greg, welcome back. Here we go. Episode 4, is that right?
Four. Yeah, it
All right,
is.
yeah. So we're back from our hiking trip, which I think it was a success in varying degrees of the word. You had some
It it was a
predictions.
success. It
Yeah,
was
for
a
sure.
success for sure. No
Yeah.
doubt about it. But yes, I did make some predictions. Two predictions on last week's podcast, and I'm sure all four of our listeners remember those
Right.
predictions. But yeah, I was 50%. I went 1 for 2. So the US women's soccer team did in fact lose to
Yeah.
Sweden, as I suspected. Although it turns out they played them pretty tough and had some real chances to win that game. But nonetheless, they did not. So I did call that one. But we did not summit the Longs
No,
Peak.
we did not, unfortunately.
The mistress continues.
We were really close. How close? I think so. I mean, you and Shane were probably about a good 20 meters further than me.
We
Only
did get we
because I
got
could not scale that damn rock.
yeah, we got a little bit farther along than you did. Yeah, so my watch, which is probably not super accurate, but close enough, told us that we were at 13,900 and like 20 feet. And I think the summit is 14,250,
Yeah.
something like that. So we were close, although I was telling some folks, I mean, we were close from a feet
Elevation.
elevation perspective,
Yeah.
but I mean, we probably still had another 45 minutes on that rock. I mean, we had a lot of we had two, as you know, the narrows and then the home stretch to go. So that's all right though. It was a lot of fun. And it just gives us another challenge to take on in the future, right?
Yeah, I agree. So, to kind of weave a little bit of the thematic of coaching into our hike, I had a really great experience for, all four of our listeners to see and actually be coached by the none other than, yours truly, the Greg Younger. I completely freaked out on the backside of this mountain. If you want to go on a YouTube video, check out the ledges for Long's Peak. And in my humble opinion, it still doesn't do it justice because there was so we get to the keyhole, there's like a 40-mile-an-hour wind just in your face.
Bro, it was so windy up there. It was just so windy. And what's wild is that you go from like nothing to something. It's just like everything's
Yeah.
beautiful. It's a nice morning, and then boom, 50-mile-an-hour winds.
Yeah, and you have to crawl. I mean, I guess you could walk if you're a normal human, but I crawled uh, across some of the places on the backside of this mountain. But yeah, I mean, my anxiety got really the best of me, and I think you put it very succinctly, right? Which is anxiety is kind of that feeling of not knowing how it's going to turn out, right? Not knowing if we're going to summit, if we're going to finish, if I'm going to fall and hit my head, whatever those things may be. And so there were times when I definitely had a huge amount of it, and I would stop and I'd say, I don't know if I can go on, you guys. And both you and Shane coached me through that. You paused, you were patient, didn't yell at me. But I think the way that you guys handled that was excellent. I think a lot of people, in as much as I'm probably the first person to ever be in the fetal position on the backside of Long's Peak.
I doubt it. I doubt it, by the
I
way.
just want to give you a shout, you and Shane a shout for coaching me through. We got to through the ledges, which I think was, pretty, in my opinion, pretty precarious, especially I didn't know going through it. And then we got to the top of the trough, which was 2,000 feet of a class 3 rock scramble.
Yeah.
Just
Brutal.
tough,
Brutal. Yeah.
super tough. Yeah. So
After having, hiked already 6.5 miles or whatever it was, right? So it's not like you're just starting your day with that. You've already been on the trail for a while, and then you have to try to succumb to that. So yeah, it's that is no joke, right? I mean, that entire mountain trail. I mean, I highly recommend it. It was super fun. I want to try to get back and try it for what would be our third time trying to summit that darn thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, you got to respect the mountain.
Right. I'll try to maybe at the very end of this episode, I can post a few pictures of us up there. So it
There's
was a
a
good time.
You got to post that one. There's a good one of you. I don't know if I took it or if Shane took it of you and leaning, against. I've showed
Right.
that one to some family and friends, and everyone's sort of like, "Whoa!" Like you
Right.
guys are up there, and it's wild up there. It is absolutely wild. You have to sit around and just be like, "Whoa, what is happening?" But yeah,
Especially
go
especially from the view of us, right? Like you're in Nashville, which is hilly, but I mean, and I'm in St. Louis, and then there's just these mountain goat people who live in in Colorado, just skip from rock to rock to rock to rock and all that
Totally
stuff. So
right. I mean, and it's a young man sport. There was a lot of 20 something guys and gals up there who were, yeah, just getting up and down there, and us old guys. But yeah, I will say, I was reflecting a little bit for this podcast and from a coaching perspective. But yeah, I think one of the interesting things about that whole experience though is, just how much I think Shane and I know who you are, and I think made that process better. I would have definitely not pushed a stranger the way that I pushed you. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
And so much of great coaching comes from understanding who you're coaching, like really understanding them, understanding what they can do, understanding what's possible for them. And I knew deep down inside you had it in you to get it done. And I really think we pretty, with the weather, for those of you who don't know, the weather sort of turned on us a little bit. We got started a little bit later than we anticipated. And I think had we had a little bit more time, I think we may have been able to get through it. But we tried to do the smart thing and turn around as it started to snow on us, actually,
right, exactly.
as we're trying to come back down through the ledges, which makes an already precarious thing even tougher. But yeah, I think anybody out there who's coaching or trying to work on their craft as a coach comes down to understanding what your players can do, and getting to know them and understanding them. And I think Shane and I deep down inside knew you had it in you.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So so we kind of hit on some of your predictions. Maybe we can make that another like kind of aspect of the show, right? So, but I know we do have kind of talk about headlines, right? So I think so you already hit on the U.S. Women's National Team. They're out.
Yeah.
Great prediction there, I guess. But like you said, a little closer than you probably expected. One of the ones that you and I were kind of chit chatting about on the hike and the camping trip was about some of these college football NCAA changes that are coming around. So maybe just give me your perspective, and for those of you who maybe aren't as up to date, the Big Ten, the Big 12, the Pac-12, and the SEC. Some of these conferences, the teams moved, and and they continue to shift. Mostly, I think, for financial purposes for the schools involved and the conferences involved. And I just took some notes here, right? Like the Big Ten added four schools out of the Pac-12. So the Big Ten is traditionally like a Midwestern conference. You got teams, like Ohio State and Michigan State and Michigan, like that central region. And now they're adding teams like USC, which is Southern California, UCLA, also California, Oregon, and Washington. A long way, a long trip, right? And I'm just going to wind through this, and then I'll turn it over to you. The Big 12, also predominantly kind of like Midwestern, maybe South Midwest, had teams like Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Greg's alma mater, Kansas State, some of those kind of teams. And they just added Arizona State, and Colorado, but they lost two powerhouse teams like Oklahoma and Texas. And in the Pac-12, I was looking today, they have 4 total teams. They were a conference of 12, and the Pac-12 Pacific, kind of thinking, Oregon, Oregon State, UCLA, all those teams. They only have 4 teams left. And then you've got
Yeah.
the SEC, Southeastern Conference, has 16 teams. It's just enormous now. So why don't you give me, your coach's perspective on, what do you think this means for student athletes, and like, how is it going to affect them? Because I think, ultimately, like college football is, I mean, we like to watch it, but they're the ones competing. They're the ones that have to deal with these changes. So talk to me about that.
Yeah. So it's fascinating all the way around. And being somebody in the Big 12, like I followed Big 12 athletics for a long time, goes back all the way to the first time that we had conference realignment. Missouri Tigers left, right, the Big 12, went to the SEC. Nebraska left the Big 12 and went to the Big 10. And then that's kind of started this domino effect every few years. It seems like we have some teams that are moving around. It seems to all be revolve around football and money. And football is obviously this main driver of revenue, and these major TV, whether it's Fox or ESPN, they're creating rights, contracts, and trying to all these schools are trying to compete for this money, right? To then fund not only their football schools or their football programs, but then also fund, right, the rest of their departments. And it's big money, right? I mean, it's big money. We're talking, 30 million a year, 50 million a year, $70 million a year. These are large sums of monies. And yeah, it's kind of, I think it's unfortunate, right? Because like, it's the football is sort of driving everything. And I think, a majority of the NCAA is made up of, the Olympic sports, right? Running and track and, baseball, or, all these other sports. I mean, I think from what I know, I think basketball is either like a break-even sport, or maybe in the case of like a Kansas or a Kentucky, it maybe makes a little bit of money, but for most
Really?
programs, it's still just a break-even sport. So football's like the only thing out there that's like super profitable. And then that pays for everything else. And so, you don't think about it much, but like if you're on the swim team, for Oregon, and they've just, signed up to be in the Big 10, that's a lot of travel, just for swim meets and, all this kind of stuff. And I think you and I were chatting a little bit about a coach who was sharing, some of the mental health issues around lack of sleep and stress. And so now we're taking athletes who are, let's not kid ourselves, these are high level athletes, but 99% of these athletes are not going to be pros. I mean, they're not going to the NFL to sign, large contracts for the NBA or even baseball, right? They're
Even the
just,
football, right? Even
yeah,
football players, right? Yeah.
exactly, right. Yeah. But still, if we just come back to the volleyball team, or, the track team, or the swim team, right? These folks are going to school. They're getting a great education. They're great athletes. It's what their passions are. It's awesome. And, that's something that we've had in the United States for a long time, right? This idea of the student athlete. And I'm sure many parents that, maybe listen to our show, or want, in the future, they're thinking about their kids, and they're thinking about D1 athletics and trying to get scholarships. And I think ultimately what it means for that is just smaller and smaller scholarships. I think that's what's ultimately going to happen, because it's just too expensive. It's expensive to travel. It's expensive. The Big 12, which I know the most about. Obviously neither one of us are experts on any of this, but I know a lot about the Big 12. So, you've got Arizona now in the Big 12, and there's Central Florida in the Big 12. Those are two
Oh, wow.
recent additions. Yeah. So think about that. I mean, that's just, the volleyball team on a Tuesday has to go to Central Florida to play their away game, right? Like that's a jaunt, right? To
And they
just,
don't and they don't probably fly in a private airline, right? They probably just go
right.
public
Just
transit.
exactly right. So, and I think that each, one of the interesting things is I think that some of these conferences at first, were saying, hey, we don't want to grow because of this problem. Like, we don't want to be all over the place. But there also becomes this like, if you can get to a certain number, like if you can get to 18 or if you can get to 20, then you can actually start to separate into like conferences and, within a conference, right? You can have like your East
Yeah.
and your West. And so, I do think I had heard some things here recently that some presidents were like, screw it. Let's get to 20 so that we can have 2 10 team conferences, and then maybe there's some help in travel. But yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, and again, I think the Olympic sports are the ones that are really going to be hurt here because a lot of partial scholarships are going to be offered because that's all you can offer, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's as your budget gets bigger and bigger, it gets harder and harder. The other interesting thing about this whole thing, which I'm not sure if this has really to do with anything, but I find it fascinating, is the Pac-12 signed or was trying to sign a rights deal with Apple. And, Apple was sort of creating this new way of sort of how do you compensate teams, entire conferences. And they were really focusing on subscriptions. And, it's interesting the way that we are consuming, right, sports. It's becoming more and more a subscription-based business, right? Where, back in the day, Fox, ESPN, you would be able to see all the major stuff on TV. You didn't really think about it as long as you had cable, right? It was going to be on. Now things are harder and harder to find. And, everything's going to Peacock or Paramount or Apple or Amazon, right? I mean, the NFL's got games on Amazon Prime. And I think that's where we're heading. And I think it's a very interesting development, I think, from a sports perspective. I remember there was a guy, well, he's still pretty popular. His name's Bill Simmons. You may be familiar with Bill Simmons, writer, sports guy, whatever. But, he used to talk about how spoiled like fans are today. And it's so true. Like not long ago, like even at a college, we didn't get every game. I mean, there were plenty of games that happened on the planet, and you didn't find out until you got the paper out the next morning. Right?
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And now today, if I can't see like AC Milan play Bayern Munich at a Champions game at 3:00 in the morning, I'm pissed. I'm like, come on. Where is this game? Let me throw money at this problem. I'll buy anything. So yeah, it's just kind of fascinating how that's all evolving, right?
Yeah, no, it is kind of, it gets frustrating for me as somebody who I don't have I have like your Netflix and your Hulus, but I don't subscribe to a lot of those, live TV kind of networks. And, I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan, but I don't even really know how to watch a game unless you have cable nowadays. And so as a fan, it gets a little frustrating for me to think I have to have 30 subscriptions in order to watch, the two teams that I like or what have you. So it is interesting. I kind of feel like we're going back to where everybody, like the cable companies, used to be these big aggregators of all these smaller kind of networks. Maybe that's and I know this isn't really kid sports related. Is that like the next genre or generation of these applications, some sort of aggregation kind of subscription service that you pay to say like, now I get all of these, right?
Yeah, right. Well, back to the sort of the youth athletics things. I mean, would you consider sort of the travel and some of the aspects that this changes for your youth athletics situation, for your own kids? I mean, if they had the opportunity to play D1 sports, would you give much thought to it? Would you be like, well, I know you're good enough to play, but I think maybe you shouldn't because the stress on you is going to be too high. All the travel,
I think it would depend. I would go back to kind of your comment earlier, just in this particular podcast, right? Know your athlete, know your kid. Because from one kid to the other, it might be a little bit different. One child may be able to handle the stress of that. Also, depending on your financial situation, I knew a guy that played at, I think it was Oregon State. He played soccer at Oregon State, and they sent tutors on trips with him so that he could complete his homework and so that he had somebody to study with and so forth. So I know those services exist, but I think it really depends upon the school and the funding and some of those support model, right? If just for instance, my oldest was going to go to a smaller D1 school that maybe didn't have those programs and didn't have the ability to, to kind of nurture his education as well as his athletic, I may advise against it, right? Because I know that there's several great baseball players that have come out of the ranks of Division II, Division III, NAIA. I think a great
Right.
example is Albert Pujols, who I think he went to a small school in Kansas City, and then he got drafted, into the minors. So you don't have to go to Division I in order to become a success. It definitely helps you get the notoriety. It's a bigger stage, but I think it's a really great question. I think that just overall, as a parent, you need to know your athlete, you need to know your child, and you need to put them in the best chance to succeed developmentally. Because just like now, for my younger kids, I want them to be middle of the pack in terms of whatever team they're on. I don't want them to be the best. I don't want them to be the worst. I want to be in like a growth kind of area on a team. Same thing goes for collegiate athletics, right? You don't want to put your kid out in a situation where they're just going to ride the pine on a D1 school for 4 years. That doesn't do them any good. So I would say know your athlete, know your kid, and make the best decision you can for him.
Yeah, I
So
think that makes a lot of sense. I think in reality that's difficult though.
yeah, oh for sure. I would definitely be. I can tell you firsthand. I can give you the politically correct answer, but then if the zoo comes trotting in here and like, hey, we want to take your son, right? I'd be like, let's go, figure it
worst
out.
worst decision ever.
Right.
No, but yeah, no. I agree. Like, yeah, I mean, and again, a lot of this stuff too is, and neither one of our kids are quite at this age yet. But the other thing is at 18, it's a big part of their decision. We're less and less involved. We can give guidance, but it's up to them. But and trying to tell an 18-year-old like, hey, you're going to be really stressed out. Maybe you should consider not going to Vanderbilt or something like that. Like, good luck, right?
Right.
But it's
Right.
tough. I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting conundrum.
I got one more headline that you will hopefully find near and dear to your heart. So to our four listeners, maybe you don't know, but Greg and I, one of the first activities where we really bonded and became friends was CrossFit. Both were CrossFit athletes, started it together, started that journey. Yeah, man, that's right. And so the CrossFit Games just completed over this past weekend. And not I don't even necessarily want to talk about the winners, but congratulations to the winners. So on the women's side, an 18-year-old took second place, which
Whoa.
I was like, holy crap, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And then another guy on the men's side, who I believe finished third, Roman Krenikov. I hope that I've said his name correctly. I really am really kind of just intrigued by his. He was in the top kind of like on the leaderboard, and then really turned his ankle or did some almost like I think he hurt it really bad. Was doing double unders on one leg for like one of the workouts and still ended up finishing third overall. I mean,
I could barely do a double under on two legs.
just I guess the thing that that I'm just kind of looking at is as a parent, I think that's an amazing kind of athlete to just kind of look at and say that's a type of mentality that I want my kids to have later on in life, right? Like, I'm hurt, but I got to finish, right? Like
Yeah,
that
right.
I think that
Can you teach
anyway,
that?
just thought, what do you think about that? I don't know.
Can he teach it? That's I
You're the
struggle.
coach. You tell me.
I struggle with that all the time. I really do. I struggle with trying to understand or think through, what can we do at the youth level. I think I've shared with you, I've had the opportunity to coach some pretty high level athletes, and the highest level athletes, I'm always so amazed by their mental makeup. I mean, you get to a certain point at the top end of youth athletics where they're all athletic. They can all play. They can all do crazy, amazing things. But the ones that really stand out are that, and it's usually defined really as just maturity, to be fair. They just come to you, maybe they're 15, but man, they act like they're 20, right? Like they just sort of matured at a place, and there's just like a mentality about them that is just so much better than anybody else. And then when you combine that with the physicalness of it, you really get something that's pretty crazy. And I just don't know how, that maturity or that mentality, I don't know how, I don't know if I have figured out how to teach that necessarily. I guess in my mind, I probably assign that more to just genetics, and I would, if I could say it one more, if I could add one more thing to that, I'd also say that I'm also a little wary of even trying to coach that or even develop that, because my sense would be that you would need to put your athlete under a lot of stress in order to then grow, sort of that muscle. And I feel like you're better off allowing that muscle to grow on its own, it almost unhindered. In other words, either the child is going to grow into the type of mentality that they need to be, or they're not. And I don't know. I think that's a very interesting concept. I think, and it's one that I think it's hard to understand, right? That mentality is, and the other thing about that too is like that mentality is just as freakish as their athletic ability. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like they are freaks of nature mentally sometimes when you really get to see these folks. And I think as parents, it's one of the things that like we can't see the makeup of our children in their mental makeup. You can't see that. You can see the physicalness of it, and I always think about, like, if you had a child who wanted to play basketball and he or she went out for like the fourth grade team or something, or, that age group. And like you went to a couple tryouts and a couple practices and like you love your child, but he or she was just horrible, right? Like just couldn't even get the ball up to the rim, couldn't dribble it, walked, just like you could just see physically just wasn't their thing, right? Well, what would you do as a parent, right? Like you'd take that child and say, hey, maybe we should try something else, right? Like if or if they got cut or didn't make the team or whatever, you might understand why, right? Because you were able to physically see it, right? What I don't think parents think a lot about is that there's an entire mental aspect to the game. Every sport we play has a mental aspect to it. And that mental aspect is how competitive is your child? How is your child able to deal with rejection? How is your child able to deal with, yelling and screaming from fans, from referees? How is your child able to deal with the stress of game day? How is your child able to like deal with the controlled environment of a practice, right? We know a lot of kids that have sort of like, almost like ADHD, right? Like they're just high energy kids, right? Like, so in other words, there's an entire mental aspect to all of our kids' lives, and especially on their sports teams, but we don't get to see those things, right? All we see is the physicalness, right? So we see our child like hit a home run, or like they could hit a baseball, like in the backyard, like they're just like they're just amazing, right? And then they get on the field and they don't perform like they do in the backyard, and it befuddles us. We don't understand why we're not seeing. And the point is that there's a whole mental makeup that you're not seeing. And as parents and as coaches, you got to really think through that. Like, how is your child prepared to take on all the mental stress of youth athletics? And maybe that's the reason why they're not successful. And maybe we shouldn't be so hard on them, right? Because as parents, we want to just be like, why are you trying? Like, where's your effort? Like, what's your,
Right.
What's your deal? Like, I know you can do it, and that's that's
Right.
hard, right? Like in the basketball court outside, in your front yard or whatever, she's stroking threes and having fun and smiling. And then all of a sudden she goes to the game and she doesn't play, or she struggles or whatever. And you're like, what the heck is wrong with you? And I think parents don't always understand that there's a mental side of the game that, has to be developed as well. And that if you're not paying attention to it, your athlete's going to struggle.
Yeah, I think, and if I can just call on a personal experience, and I think I've discussed it a little bit on a previous podcast, was, my oldest went to feel like he was in a championship game when he was like 8 or 9. He hadn't been in the whole game, and I've seen him field this ball 100 times at this point, and he fields the ball just cleanly. I'm like, oh yeah, he's gonna make this last out of the game, gonna win literally gonna win the championship, and he just sails it right, like way past the first baseman. Now, thankfully, they ended up winning the championship, so it didn't hit it, like it didn't hurt his, I guess, a long-term development. But what I realized is that he wasn't comfortable out there, right? Like mentally he wasn't comfortable, and physically he wasn't comfortable. And so that was also one of the reasons why we left that team, was so he could go have a place where he could make a bunch of mistakes, right? He probably had a lot of anxiety. Again, going back to what we talked about earlier in this episode, he didn't know how it was going to end up. He didn't know how, like, he hadn't done that so many times that he was comfortable doing it.
Yeah.
And I would say some of that mental toughness that you're talking about is, I've been here before, I've done it, I know the outcome, I know I can do it again.
Right.
And so that's why I would encourage parents to put kids in that middle tier where they're going to get opportunity, they're going to fail, it's going to be okay. And they're going to be able to kind of grow as an athlete, because as they make mistakes, I think you grow mentally through mistakes. That's kind of the way I feel about it.
Yeah, I agree. And just to like that original point of that athlete who sort of takes third with doing double unders on one leg. Was that developed? Was that mentality developed, or are they born with it? And I think kind of like our athletic ability is like 80%, right? Like either you're born, with some athletic ability, or you're not, right? Like I can't get you all the way there. Right. And I think mentally it's the same thing, right? Like, you 80% is like your, competitive, I always say that, like, give me a kid who's competitive and I will find a place for him or her to play. Like that's the attribute that I most want to see mentally, is our kids who, like, in practice, you play like a little 1v1 and they're just like, I hear you.
Okay, so we had a little bit of a technical difficulty there. Greg and I are working through these. We're still really low budget, so I apologize. So the topic for today's episode was pay to play. So, again, to our 4 listeners, maybe I just ask the question: whenever I say pay to play, what does that mean to you, Coach?
Well, first of all, I think this could be an entire season of discussions. Right. So let's wrap up pay to play in 20 minutes. I think a pay to play is essentially, this concept that in order to get access to high level youth athletics, you've got to pay for it, and that there is a structure inside the United States that basically, creates a haves and a have-nots of youth athletic training, and that's based on how much money you have. And I think we're seeing it across the board. I mean, I think for a long time, whether it was soccer or whatever, there was this feeling of pay to play. But I think we're seeing it more and more throughout, a lot of different sports where, everything from the personal training to the one-on-ones, but also then just to get access to the best, leagues and the best teams. It's just payment and it's travel. And it's this idea that, if you're not willing to pay thousands of dollars, then you won't get access to them. And then what the problem with that becomes is that we're leaving really good athletes behind, right? We're leaving athletes who are, maybe coming from, lower economic means. These athletes are not getting access to the coaches and to the training that they need to be successful. And so then it's hurting us on the national stage, or the world stage. And so it just turning it back to the World Cup soccer, soccer has to be one of the worst pay to play situations in America, both on the girls and on the boys side. And so there's a lot of concern that, 2 decades, 3 decades of pay to play has turned out the situation where we're starting to fall behind on the women's side, and on the men's side, we've always struggled. So that's what it means to me. And I think it's a big, big problem in youth athletics. And I don't really know how to solve it, but I can identify it as a problem.
Well, maybe instead of like trying to solve it, all right. So we identified, in the let's take soccer as like a microcosm, because I think it's a good sport where we have it in the United States. It fits into that pay to play model, but we also have the rest of the world that's not the United States who's able to do this, right? Same sport, right? So if you pick American football, you'd probably mostly focus on the United States. Baseball, same thing. So let's use soccer in this particular example. What and maybe even basketball, because I think basketball is kind of coming up in the world stage as well. But as far as I still think the United States is highly dominant there, but perhaps the world's catching up. So, what is do you know what the rest of the world does in order to, how does the rest of the world do it? How does England come up with like the best soccer players in the world, every other couple years?
Well, I think that there's, and of course, every country is different, but I think that there is some sort of pay to play in a lot of different developed countries. England in particular, had the opportunity to coach with some coaches from England who have shared with me that, in many cases that, their parents and some of their youth soccer is not a whole lot worse or better than ours. Of course, there's some cultural aspects to it as well, where, so many kids play, right, the sport. And so, obviously, that helps. I think where we're really different in the United States is that I think we talked about this on a previous podcast, but we have this issue with real estate. We have this issue with size, right? And so a lot of these smaller European countries, they have this benefit of sort of like, soccer player per capita, right? Like where they're all on top of each other, right? So that sort of helps. And whereas like in the United States, if you're a fantastic soccer player living in Wyoming, it could be very difficult for you to find, places to go and places to be. But I would say one of the biggest differences between European soccer and us has to do at the club level. Now, I actually just read something about this the other day, and so there could be some thawing out of this concept. But for a long time, the way that it's worked in Europe is that if a player gets signed to a professional contract, a portion of that contract trickles down to the club that the youth athlete was trained at.
Really?
Yeah. So if your child went to the Bayern Munich academy and was signed there as not as a professional, just in the academy, and then they go on to sign a contract at Liverpool for $100 million. Bayern Munich actually would get a portion of that. Now it's not the whole thing, but there's a percentage to it. We saw with Christian Pulisic when he got signed at Chelsea, which I think at that point was the largest contract ever signed by a U.S. player. The club that Pulisic started with up in the Northeast in Hershey, Pennsylvania, asked U.S. Soccer for their portion, and U.S. Soccer kept it. So U.S. Soccer got the payment. It wasn't as if it wasn't paid out. It was paid out due to sort of the FIFA international rules.
Right.
Hey, here's a chunk. There you go. But it was not divvied out to the club. And the thought process, I believe, is that FIFA said, well, we don't really have any rules on how this works. So we're just going to keep it. So one of the things that does, though, if you think about it, if you have an entire system built that way, it allows clubs to get compensated for development. I mean, that's an incentive-based deal, right? And so what you see in Europe a lot is there's a lot of clubs who really, they're almost as well known for their academies than anything else. So that they can't really compete at the senior level. But, whether you're a West Ham United or, any of these other sort of really high level academies, they really thrive on creating these awesome environments, bringing great people in, and then selling those people. And as they've gone on to have fruitful professional careers, they get money. They're continuing to get money. And so then what they can do is then turn around and keep their costs either low or offer scholarships or whatever. And so, what would be great is if we started to see similar ideas here in the United States. And again, that could be applied to football, it could be applied to baseball, it could be applied to soccer, where, if you had a baseball club or a softball club that was developing players throughout, the country, and every time they signed a professional contract, there was a little bits and pieces that could be thrown back into the club, then that allows that club, right, to at least have another revenue stream. So it doesn't have to all come from the parent. So again, my understanding is some of that is now thought, and that U.S. Soccer is beginning to sort of change its tune there. So if you listen to this podcast and want to make a comment or share with us the latest news, I'd be happy to hear it. But I think that is, off the top of my head, one major difference between what they do in Europe and what we do here.
Okay, so let me ask this question. I mean, I did not know that. That is actually quite amazing, right? And my immediate thought was like scholarships, and now you can kind of bring players in. You can reduce travel costs. You can reduce club fees, and so now you have an avenue for people, the less kind of affluent, to join some of these clubs, which I think is essentially what that should be used for, hopefully,
Right.
or
Yeah.
if you have a good honest club owner.
Yeah.
But so let me just ask a couple questions here. Maybe you don't know. So if Christian Pulisic signs with another club, does that other contract still, a portion of that goes and funnels down?
Yeah.
So the longer and the more deal. Oh, wow. So like that, I can see how that would really create a lot, again, like you said, a really development minded environment, right? I'm thinking of a particular club right now, baseball club that's around here, and I won't name names, but at a particular age group, they'll have 7, 8, 9, 10 teams, all in the same age group, and it's still just a dad coaching a bunch of boys, but you have access to like the facilities, or
Right.
some cage time and stuff like that. So that's kind of what you pay for. But as far as development, I can't really think of too many baseball clubs around here that really focus on, hey, let's take a group of kids and let's develop them and like really put time, energy, effort, and finances into making these kids great. So,
Yeah.
wow, that's a pretty interesting model. I don't think that I knew that even existed. I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds
And
like it could be a real way to combat the pay to play.
and you can imagine in Europe where they've got these, really large clubs, really great academies, and they have dozens and dozens of professional athletes that are being paid out at all different levels, within
Yeah.
the system. So it's not all just the Christian Pulisics or, whatever the Messis or whatever that are signing these super large contracts. It's just your regular professional, right? You sell it, a couple million here, a couple million there, all that sort of adds up and that all trickles down. So I'd love to see something like that, across the board here in the United States, especially as, from a soccer perspective, especially as our domestic league continues to grow and again, just sort of your run-of-the-mill club might start to have 4 or 5 athletes that are signed professionally. Again, they don't have to be making multi-millions, but if every time they're signing something, you're getting a check. I mean, for some of these clubs, a $25,000 check would be a boom, right? That would be a
Right.
huge,
Yeah.
addition to their sort of what they are able to do and how, what sort of resources they can start to put in to the kids. But that all starts at the highest level. And I think one of the interesting things about youth sports is just how disorganized we are. Like I'm surprised and fascinated with the hockey in the United States and how sort of like organized that seems to be and how much authority is given to USA Hockey, right? Like it seems like that's a system with a real clear hierarchy. Soccer's abomination. There's like 7 leagues. There's all kinds of different competition. There's different rules. You can play here. You can't play. There doesn't seem to be like one overarching, sort of like definitive, almost like a government structure in soccer. And again, I don't know how it works with baseball and some of these other sports, but in order to set up something like that, where we're paying, professional contracts back to the training clubs, you definitely have to have a level of organization that goes nationwide. And I think if I was a US soccer apologist, I would say that it's easy for us to do this for Christian Pulisic because it's Christian Pulisic. But if we assign this for Christian Pulisic, we're going to be hit with 1,000 lawsuits and they're going to be asking us because all of these athletes, right, that have been signed. And so, I think there's some, there's some work that needs to be done, but I'd love to see it happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in my head, I'm thinking, more, I'm not going to get into political views here, but I'll just say that I don't advocate for more like government oversight, but maybe it's really about each of the leagues taking more ownership into the development of youth players, right? Like Major League Baseball, NHL, NBA, taking more ownership into youth athletics to pay things down, like you said, and they can kind of create, kind of a system to make sure that they have a funnel because they have a vested interest into creating athletes, right? They need athletes to continue their brand, and so if they can invest at that lower level, how better can their brand be long term? So I mean, I think what you're talking about, it makes a lot of sense. I don't see how you're ever going to get away 100% from pay to play, but what you do create is you create more of this kind of checks and balances where, again, where you can get better athletes, and even if their parents can't afford it, you can find a way to fund them to play and develop, and so which I think is ultimately the point that we're talking about with pay to play, right?
Yeah. A couple other quick thoughts I'd have on pay to play too.
Sure.
Is sort of like as fired up as I can get about pay to play. One of the things I always try to remind myself of is that the cream in this country does rise to the top, and I don't think that we have a serious issue with finding great athletes. Now, I think there could be an argument that in the soccer community that we may be losing out on athletes to basketball or baseball or football. But that's not really a pay to play issue. That's sort of a cultural issue or any number of issues. I mean, I think that's one of the things that, as parents, as parents of youth athletes, we should always continue to remind ourselves is that if our kid is a really good athlete, things will work out for them. And sometimes as parents, we just have to recognize that, the athlete is who the athlete is. So, I think, for those people who are really, really, really against pay to play or staunch critics of it, there's this feeling there's thousands of athletes that we're losing every year. I don't fall into that camp, because what I have seen is the other side, which is, a kid will just show. I mean, I've seen parents come to me and say, Johnny's got a guy on his basketball team that just sprung up, and he's 6'8". He's a great athlete. You need to be talking to his parents, right? Like, there's so much competitive nature in America that if a kid can do anything athletically, a coach, a parent, an administrator, another kid,
Yeah.
right? We all know, you're like, come on, you got to go play on our team, right? So
Right.
it's almost
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I think they're found. I mean, I think, again, athletes will rise to the top. So I don't know if that's necessarily like a real big issue, but the thing so that's the first point I make. And then the second point I would make is that, I think that one of the issues with pay to play and why it's getting so out of control is that parents have a real problem saying no and sort of putting in some thoughts and some real intentionality around what they're doing. And, recognizing that as a parent, you don't have to say yes to everything. And that I think that if we had a better culture in America of parents focusing and recognizing what really is important, I think we would see less pay to play. Just goes back to like your baseball and having dads coaching. And it's like, what is the most important thing, for a 10-year-old athlete? In my opinion, it's training. It's development.
Yeah.
The games are fun, but they're not important. The travel is fun. It's great to build camaraderie, and it's cool to go to a different city and play some games. But at the end of the day, it's your child's development that is the most important. It is that training that is the most important. And yet 90% of all youth athletics are built backwards, right?
Focus on competition.
The team meeting or the recruiting meeting, you're right. It's all about, where are we going to travel? Where are we going to go? What A are we? What's right? What are we doing? Right.
Yeah.
And yet there's nobody who is saying, hey, this is what we do from a training perspective, or we don't see it very much. And a lot of times, and I have to be honest with you too, like, I've been part of cultures where we've focused on the training, where we've led with training, we've led parents and said, hey, this is what we do with training. Parents don't care.
Well,
they don't care. They don't care.
Because I should say, my opinion, we're so focused on outcome in this, and also to couple outcome with kind of like instant gratification, right? Like, so the outcome of training is, in 10 years, I have an amazing athlete who can compete at a high level, right?
Right.
Whereas the outcome of being on this AAA team is, I win a lot of games right now. And so that, again, that's been our kind of theme of this whole season one, is that focus on that 10-year journey. So if you're able to step back, if you're able to have that view, development becomes way more important than how well your 13U season was or your 12U season, and that longevity of an athlete, really becoming an athlete, is the focus, rather than becoming a good 12U soccer player, volleyball player, basketball player. So no, I think that's great.
I'll give you a personal story on that, just to show you how much I believe in that. So my middle son had been playing some club soccer for a long time, and I'd coached him for a long time. He recently took some time off and wanted to come back into playing club soccer. And we went and did a tryout for a team. And I watched at least big chunks, not the whole thing, but I watched big chunks of both of these trainings, and they were fantastic. Very, very well done trainings, very, very good trainings, trainings that I feel like I would be the types of things that I would be doing as a soccer coach. And so turns out my middle son was not able to make the roster on this team. because quite frankly, they had too many kids. They were over rostered. And so we had the choice to go look for another team, do another tryout, or try some different ideas. But both my middle son and I agreed that the best thing for his development right now, and he'll be heading into high school next year, and making a high school team is important to him, was getting training from that coach, because there's no question that coach is the best thing for him. So he signed on to be a training only player. So he chose to not play games, at least in this first fall season, and just train 2 to 3 times a week with this team. And for me, that is so good. I think that is so great.
Yeah.
I mean, as a parent, do I wish I could go out and watch him play on the weekend? Sure. As a player, is it tough? I mean, was it tough for him to hear that turns out they don't have room for him, but they still like him enough to offer him? Yeah, that's hard. It's hard for a 14-year-old to go to training and not play games. But at the end of the day, I can't imagine a better spot for him than having great training every 2 to 3 weeks. And then, the games can come play later. And I would say that there is not a lot of parents out there who would do that.
I would probably, as a parent, I probably agree with you. Yeah. Well, Greg, we've been chit chatting for well over 45 minutes.
It's awesome.
I feel like
it's a good one.
Yeah, good one. I think we covered a lot. I think we got one more in this season that we want to do.
Our rookie season. Okay, so let's have another not bet, but what
prediction.
Prediction. Okay, so here's my question.
Okay.
We have a guest that we both think would be fantastic for our 5th and final show. Does he agree to join us on the 5th show? Yes or no? What is your prediction?
This individual is one of my favorite people in the world.
Same.
And so, and I think he would be an amazing add to the show.
Same.
I'm going to say that he says no.
Really?
I want him to prove me wrong. This is a challenge.
Here's what I think is going to happen. I think you're going to cut this clip out of this podcast, and then you're going to send that to him, and just to prove you wrong and make it look like you don't know what you're talking about, he's going to show up. He's going to join us on the 5th one. It would be fantastic. And I think regardless if he is able to join us, I hope we get a chance to chat about nutrition, and because I think that's an awesome, weights and when, I have a lot of questions. When's the right time? What's the right age to start thinking about, weight training? How important is nutrition? How important is some of this stuff? What can you teach? What can't you teach? So I think either way, I think it'd be a good topic for our next episode, but I know this particular person would be a great addition. So I'm going to say yes. He'll be joining us.
Well, hopefully, I think I'm going to do exactly what you said. I'm just going to trim that beginning part of it, not the part where you say yes. Definitely going to send it to him.
Yes.
And I think he has a lot to offer,
for sure.
To not just from the nutrition standpoint, because I think there's also we'll let him tell who he is if he comes on. But he has a lot of knowledge about kind of like movement and joints and muscle and like development. And so I think that just as an all around, as a parent, he's somebody, if I didn't know him personally, he's somebody that I'd want to talk to about, like, how do I make my athlete, how do I make sure that, they don't get hurt long term? What are some exercises or what are things to think about as we play these year-round sports? How can I protect my athlete? So I think that's what we want to cover next, and then hopefully our 5th and final episode. So hopefully next episode we have a guest with us.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
All right, Greg, it's been fun. It's been great, and I'll see you next time.
Peace.
Bye.